On January 4, 1903, this elephant, named Topsy, was put to death by electrocution in front of 1,500 people. Edison recorded everything. The film, titled Electrocuting an Elephant, was the first recording of a real death and was shown across the country. And as if this wasn't cruel enough, things get worse when you know the context. According to some historians, Edison provided advice to carry out that execution with a single purpose: to demonstrate that alternating current was dangerous, or so it is believed. The resentment still ran through his veins after another illustrious inventor of that era had shown him a few years earlier that he was wrong about the principles he defended. That person was Nikola Tesla, who never sacrificed animals to prove his ideas and called himself a staunch defender of all life on Earth. A way of thinking that may have doomed him in more than one way, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Tesla was not just an inventor, he was a visionary who lived in a parallel world within his own mind. A man who spoke with lightning and saw energy where others saw emptiness. He didn't need to build to test, he imagined every piece, every gear, every movement inside his head. And he could make an entire engine work without touching a single screw. Throughout his life, people viewed him with both fascination and fear. They admired him as a magician, called him a madman, and ignored him when his brilliance threatened the powerful. His story is not just that of a brilliant scientist, it's the story of a man who swung between genius and obsession, between revelation and isolation, between the spark and the shadow. It's true that he had premonitions and saw things, that he was one of the first to make contact with beings from another planet. He suffered a smear campaign from elites who saw their empire threatened by his ideas. What was the goal of his experiments, and why was he connected to the Tunguska incident? Why did the FBI seize all his notebooks after he died? To try to answer these and other questions, we'll dive into this special about Tesla. Let's begin. The Son of Thunder. On July 10, 1856, a thunderstorm hit the small village of Smiljan in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The sky roared violently, lightning lit up the hills, and the villagers crossed themselves when they heard the thunder. In the midst of that storm, a midwife drenched in sweat and fear was attending a difficult birth. When the child was finally born, a lightning bolt streaked across the sky and bathed the room in white light. Trembling, she murmured, "This child will be a son of darkness." But his mother calmly replied, "He will not be a son of light." That child was named Nikola Tesla, and that scene, half prophecy, half myth, would be remembered as an omen. Nikola Tesla was born into a world that still did not know the true power of electricity. His home was a place where the nights were dark and stories were told by candlelight. His family belonged to the Serbian Orthodox community, and from the very beginning, Tesla was marked by a constant duality. One side of him leaned towards spirituality and faith, while his other side held tightly to science and reason. To understand the depth and origin of these contradictions, it's enough to take a look at his inner circle. His father, Milutin Tesla, was a priest with an analytical mind and a prodigious memory. He loved poetry and rhetoric and hoped his son would follow him into the clergy. He was a strict, disciplined man, but also deeply cultured. For her part, Duka Mandik, Nikola's mother, could neither read nor write, but she was a natural inventor. She designed tools, household devices, and came up with ingenious solutions for everyday problems at home. She was said to have a mechanical mind and remarkable intuition. Tesla, years later, would admit that his genius did not come from his father's books, but from his mother's creative talent. Since childhood, Nikola displayed unusual sensitivity and experienced episodes his peers couldn't understand. Flashes of light would appear before his eyes, sudden visions that forced him to withdraw from reality. They happened every day. When someone mentioned a word, he said he saw the image of the object so vividly that it was hard for him to distinguish it from the real world. Today, we might call it extreme synesthesia or vivid mental imagery. But back then, he was just considered a strange, disturbed, or even sick child. At the age of 7, a tragic event would mark his life forever. The death of his brother Dane, whom he greatly admired and later called a superior mind. According to some accounts, Nikola witnessed the accident. A runaway horse knocked him down and killed him. Since then, Tesla was plunged into a feeling of guilt and loss that would accompany him for the rest of his life. His family claimed that after that event, his gaze changed. He spoke less, slept little, and spent hours lost in thought, imagining impossible machines. Others say that it all began with a less tragic but equally magical event. One day, while petting a cat, he received a shock from static electricity and was fascinated. One way or another, it's clear that during his childhood in Smiljan, young Tesla began to develop a drive to study natural phenomena. He played with streams, spun water wheels, and built small wind-powered mechanisms. He even said he would bring his inventions to Niagara Falls when he grew up. He said he brought smiles to those close to him who never expected this would happen so precisely. But beyond his curiosity, Tesla was not what you could describe. Like a cheerful child, he often got sick, suffered nervous breakdowns, high fevers, and, as we mentioned, episodes of sensory hypersensitivity. A little extra light could cause him physical pain, the touch of a fabric, repulsion, the sound of a fly, unbearable discomfort. He himself would describe those sensations as an overload of the nervous system. Besides that, he was a quiet, obsessive perfectionist who couldn't tolerate disorder or imperfection, and his mind was never satisfied with what was visible. For him, the universe was a web of hidden forces waiting to be revealed. When he entered elementary school, his talent became evident. He memorized entire books and solved math problems in his head without writing a single number. His teachers, incredulous, constantly tested him, convinced that he was cheating. But Tesla simply sought in images. Every calculation, every formula unfolded before him on a three-dimensional blackboard that he could observe from every angle. During his teenage years, the family moved to Karlovac, where Tesla attended high school. There, he encountered electricity for the first time when a teacher demonstrated how an electrostatic machine worked. That simple experiment astonished him. Years later, he wrote, "An unseen force made the world turn. In that moment, I knew I'd devote my life to understanding it." However, his health turned against him again. He contracted cholera and was on the verge of death for months. His father, desperate, promised that if he survived, he would allow him to study engineering and not theology as he had planned. Nikola survived and, with the promise kept, began forging his destiny. When he finally left his hometown to continue his studies, his mother said goodbye to him with a phrase he would never forget. "Nikola, you will be a great man, but remember, greatness is not in what you create, but in what you give." That statement, a mix of blessing and warning, would mark his life. Because Tesla didn't just want to build machines, he wanted to give energy to the world, to unleash the power of lightning for everyone. But it would still be many years before that dream took shape. At that time, the thin young man leaving Smiljan carried only a suitcase and a mind capable of imagining and changing the future. A misunderstood gift. Tesla's first stop was the city of Karlovac, where he completed his secondary education with outstanding grades. There, his interest in physics and mathematics intensified, and his teachers began to recognize something extraordinary in him. In 1875, with a scholarship from his region's military government, the young man entered the Polytechnic Institute of Graz. In Austria, it was a place where science was beginning to flourish with the momentum of the Industrial Revolution. There he encountered Graham's direct current machine for the first time. He became obsessed with creating a better, more efficient version that eliminated the sparks and losses of earlier models. In his personal notes, Tesla wrote that he dreamed of a motor that worked without brushes or physical contact, powered by the alternating current of the universe. His early years in Graz were defined by extreme discipline, studying from 3 a.m. to 11 with little sleep or food. He read treatises on electrical engineering, physics, advanced mathematics, as well as poetry, philosophy, and Slavic literature. His photographic memory allowed him to remember every word, every diagram, every equation. However, that same ability made him a solitary person. The other students admired him, but they couldn't understand him. As time went by, his obsession with electrical experiments began to raise concerns among his teachers. One of them, the renowned Jacob Porsche, warned him that his idea of creating an alternating current motor was impossible, that it violated the laws of unknown physics. That phrase, far from discouraging him, became his personal challenge. Tesla promised himself to prove the opposite, but once again, fate put obstacles in his way. His father, Milutin, died suddenly in 1879, and with his passing, the family's economic stability collapsed. Nikola left Graz before finishing his studies. Years later, his enemies would use that fact to discredit him, claiming that he had never obtained a formal university degree. The truth is that, although he did not graduate, his education and knowledge far surpassed those of many engineers of his time. For a brief period, he worked as a teacher and then moved to Prague, where he attended classes at the university. He couldn't officially enroll because he arrived after the deadline and didn't fully master Latin, but he attended experimental physics and philosophy courses as an auditor. It was there that he began to refine the idea that would obsess him for years: the rotating magnetic field, a fundamental principle for the development of alternating current. At that time, he first noticed what he would later call his illness of the mind. Basically, what happened was that the symptoms that had accompanied him as a child intensified to extreme levels. Tesla struggled with chronic insomnia and nervous exhaustion, sometimes needing to withdraw for days. He said he could hear the ticking of a clock 3 rooms away, or that sunlight was unbearable for him. Every stimulus overwhelmed him, and yet, in those moments of isolation, his mind seemed to expand. One night, while walking through a park in Budapest in 1882, inspiration struck him, with overwhelming clarity. He saw before his eyes the complete image of the alternating current motor that had eluded him until then. The windings, the rotating magnetic field, the perfect and harmonious movement. That moment would change his life forever. He had conceived one of the most important inventions in modern history, but he still didn't have the means to build it. The following years would be a constant struggle to bring his ideas into the real world. After working briefly for a telephone company in Budapest, Tesla moved to Paris and then to Strasbourg, where he worked for the Continental Edison company. There he installed lighting systems and electric motors, perfecting his practical experience. His talent again drew his superiors' attention, who saw him as an exceptional technician. But Tesla didn't just want to fix machines, he aimed to redefine electricity itself. In fact, he dreamed of meeting Thomas Alva Edison, the Wizard of Menlo Park, the man who dominated the electric business in the United States. He thought that together they could change reality. In his fantasies, Edison listened to him, was amazed by his ideas, and became his patron. He didn't know yet that this meeting would be the beginning of one of the most legendary rivalries in the history of science. So, at just 28 years old without money and with a letter of recommendation in his pocket, Tesla took a ship bound for America. The journey was tough. He arrived in New York in 1884 with almost no belongings, after being robbed and losing his tools and documents. The young man who disembarked at New York port. He wasn't just another immigrant, he carried a revolution in his mind. A dreamer who saw in every glimmer of the sky the model of a perfect machine. Even though the world didn't know, that man was about to change civilization's course. The New World. It was 1884, and the streets were beginning to light up with the first direct current systems. The newspapers talked about the miracle of artificial light, and the name Thomas Alva Edison was synonymous with progress. The letter that Tesla was carrying was addressed precisely to the latter and came from Charles Batchelor, one of the engineers closest to the American inventor. In it, Batchelor wrote a phrase that would become famous. "I know 2 great men, and you are one of them. The other is this young man." A few days later, Tesla was received by Edison himself in his laboratory. The scene, as recounted by Tesla himself years later, is almost cinematic. The American, robust and pragmatic, faced the tall, thin Slav with a strong accent. 2 opposite worlds that represented 2 ways of understanding science. Edison was an empiricist who relied on trial and error in his workshop. Tesla, on the other hand, was a theoretical visionary with altruistic interests. After a brief exchange of words and a firm handshake, Edison offered him a job. Tesla started by repairing electric generators and soon stood out for his ability to improve and enhance the systems that came to him. However, far from being a good omen, this quickly caused the relationship between them to become strained. Accounts say Tesla offered to redesign Edison's generators for greater efficiency. Edison, amused, reportedly said, "I'll pay you $50,000 if you do it." Tesla met the challenge, but when he asked for his reward, Edison laughed and replied, "Tesla, don't you understand American humor?" Embarrassed and angry, Tesla resigned at once. It was the beginning of a rivalry that would mark his entire life. This was about something bigger than a clash of egos. Tesla and Edison had different visions, not only in the professional field, but above all in the human sphere. Without work and without money, Tesla survived for months doing manual labor, digging ditches and repairing cables. Even so, his mind never stopped working. In 1887, with the help of several investors, he founded his own company, Tesla Electric Light and Manufacturing. He then revealed his great creation to the world, the alternating current motor. Could this invention alter humanity's history forever? Meanwhile, Edison was promoting his direct current system, which was inefficient for long distances and expensive. Tesla demonstrated that alternating current could transmit energy for kilometers without the need for multiple booster stations. However, technical success didn't ensure economic success. At that moment, George Westinghouse, a visionary entrepreneur and industrial giant, appeared and recognized the value of Tesla's system, buying his patents. Together, they formed an alliance aimed at challenging Edison's dominance. What followed was a true electrical war known as the War of the Currents. The War of the Currents. In 1879, Edison had introduced the incandescent light bulb and would embark on 8 years of testing to bring his invention into every home. Finally, he had come up with a solution: direct current, which replaced steam as a source of energy. Although the system was received with enthusiasm, it had some basic drawbacks. The wires often melted as the current passed through them, and the current itself couldn't be transmitted over long distances. This, along with the ability to transmit current. Distances led New York's streets to fill with generators and thick copper wires tangled above the confused, distrustful citizens. In 1888, because of the Great White Hurricane, several of those wires fell and more than 400 people were electrocuted. Still, Edison, supported by strong economic interests, launched an aggressive media campaign against Tesla and Westinghouse. He claimed that alternating current was dangerous, that it could kill people. In a series of public demonstrations, Edison electrocuted animals to demonstrate the supposed risks of Tesla's system. It was a cruel and propagandistic maneuver that stained his reputation and showed how far he was willing to go, exposing even his monopoly. Tesla, for his part, responded with elegance. His demonstrations were spectacles of light and science. He would pass current through his body to light bulbs, project rays from his hands, and talk about the future as if he could see it with his eyes wide open. The public nicknamed him the Wizard of Electricity. In 1893, the battle reached its climax when the Chicago World's Fair decided to light up the entire venue. With the alternating current system of Tesla and Westinghouse, millions of visitors were amazed by the power and safety of the new system. Edison, defeated, saw how his business model became obsolete. That year, Tesla went further by proposing a hydroelectric plant at Niagara Falls, a project that seemed like science fiction then. In 1896, the dream came true, also proving that what he had prophesied as a child had come true. The water falling from the heights of Niagara began to turn turbines that generated alternating current electricity, which was transmitted dozens of kilometers away, until it illuminated Buffalo. The press proclaimed it as Tesla's triumph, even though Edison would remain in his position of power. He received an undeniable knockout honor, crowned by a famous phrase from Tesla: "The present belongs to Edison, but the future is mine." But even in success, the inventor remained indifferent to glory. He was not a businessman. He wasn't interested in getting along with people in power. He disliked social gatherings that pulled him from his lab, causing others to view him unfavorably. While his contemporaries were amassing fortunes, he invested everything he had in new projects, convinced that science should serve the common good. He cared little for fame, but even less for what was going on in his own mind. They were ideals. It was the echo of his mother's words. He was simply unable to stop. His mind was already elsewhere. He dreamed of wireless energy transmission, airborne information transfer, and a global communication system. While the world was just beginning to understand electricity, Tesla was already envisioning the wireless era. The promise of the new world seemed to be fulfilled, but beneath that surface of admiration and lights, shadows were beginning to form. Betrayals, debts, stolen patents, and oblivion were waiting for him just around the corner. The man who had lit up the planet was about to be left in the dark, and that's how our story returns to the beginning. Tesla versus the world. The triumph of alternating current made Nikola Tesla a famous figure. The press described him as the man who had conquered lightning. His name appeared with Edison's, but with a key difference. Edison symbolized industry and business, while Tesla embodied mystery and inspiration as the romantic scientist of his time. He established his lab on South Fifth Avenue in New York, later moving to East Houston Street, beginning one of his most productive periods. There he perfected the induction motor and developed the resonant transformer that would bear his name, the famous Tesla coil. And he worked on wireless power transmission systems, X-rays, remote control, and even wireless lighting. Each experiment was a mix of science and spectacle. Tesla wasn't just looking for results, he wanted to dazzle, to show that electricity could be beautiful. He invited journalists, investors, and curious people to his presentations. Between 1891 and 1893, Tesla gave a series of lectures in the United States and Europe that established him as one of the most admired scientists in the world. He spoke precisely, yet with a strange poetic quality. He described electricity as a breath of the universe, saying that someday humanity could capture energy from the air itself, from the vibrations that surround the earth. During those years, he met great figures of his time, like Mark Twain, who was fascinated by his experiments and became his friend. However, Tesla never quite fit in with high society salons. He was polite and charismatic but distant, avoiding alcohol, tobacco, and romance. He slept barely 2 hours a night and spent the rest of the time designing machines in his head. At that moment, at the peak of his creativity and with minimal acceptance from society, an event occurred that is still analyzed to this day. It was early morning on March 13, 1895. The city slept under a blanket of industrial fog when on Southfield Avenue, a column of smoke began to rise above the rooftops at number 33. An entire building was burning furiously. Nikola Tesla's laboratory was being consumed by the flames. The fire spread so quickly that the firefighters could do little. The explosions that could be heard from the street were those of the generators and electrical condensers that were bursting one after another within hours. A whole decade of work vanished. Newspapers then called it a vision of hell. Melted cables, twisted metal, and unrecognizable devices. And at the center of it all, the laboratory, which had been considered one of the temples of modern science, was reduced to ashes. Tesla arrived when nothing could be saved. Witnesses remembered him standing still, watching smoke rise over his life. He lost everything. His experimental coils, his electrical transmission models, his handwritten notes and measurement records, his tools, even the photographs of the high-voltage discharge experiments. Every invention, idea, and unpatented data he had disappeared that night. However, as time went by, the official versions of what happened began to seem incomplete. According to the firefighters' report, the fire had started on the lower floor of the building, where a photography company operated. They said the fire spread upward, reaching the laboratory. But many of those who knew the place were aware that Tesla took extreme precautions. He had guards, monitored the temperature of the equipment, and stored his flammable materials in isolated compartments. Any carelessness was unimaginable. From there, a darker theory emerged, the possibility that the fire was not an accident. Let's agree that a man who claimed electricity could reach every home on the planet for free was a threat to the industry magnates. So it had been an attack. Someone had decided it was time to play dirty. The answer remains hidden. What we want to know now is what Tesla did in the face of this, which could have destroyed anyone's career. He simply started over in 1899, driven by the need to experiment on a large scale. He moved to Colorado Springs, where he built a gigantic laboratory to study lightning and electromagnetic waves. There, he carried out some of the most astonishing experiments of his career. It was also in Colorado where Tesla believed he had picked up signals coming from space. Contact with the Beyond. In the summer of 1899 on the dry plains of Colorado Springs, Nikola Tesla worked alone in his laboratory, surrounded by machines that seemed to breathe. Every night, artificial lightning lit the horizon, painting the sky blue. The air crackled with electricity and the ground shook. Under his feet, Tesla was obsessed with an idea that consumed him completely: to prove that the Earth could become a universal conductor of energy. There were feats that bordered on magic. His coils could light lamps kilometers away, without the need for wires. The energy traveled through the air, obedient to his will. But one night, while he was measuring the electrical variations in the atmosphere, something different happened. Amid the constant noise of his instruments, he began to hear a sequence of rhythmic, repetitive pulses, too regular to be accidental. They weren't storm discharges or natural vibrations. They were patterns, precise intervals, pulses that seemed to have meaning. Tesla stood still, listening. He had spent years interpreting the invisible sounds of the world, but this was different. He felt a presence, a kind of order behind the noise. During the following nights, he repeated the experiment over and over again, adjusted the sensitivity of the receivers, recorded every signal, and the pattern remained unchanged. It didn't take him long to be convinced. He was picking up something not of this earth in his mind. The idea took shape like a revelation. Someone, somewhere in space was trying to communicate. And if that was true, there was only one possible candidate. At that time, Mars was the epicenter of scientific imagination. The astronomer Percival Lowell had just announced the existence of canals on the Martian surface, structures that many believed to be artificial. For Tesla, that fit with what he was hearing. The pulses were messages, signals sent from the red planet. In the following months, Tesla spoke publicly about his discovery. In an interview, he said, "I'm sure beings from other worlds are trying to speak to us. I was the first to hear their greeting." The news spread through newspapers in several countries. Some scientists supported him, others considered him eccentric, even delusional. Tesla did not back down. He dreamed of responding to that message using electricity as a universal language, sending pulses from his towers that could travel through the ether and reach other planets. The nights in Colorado Springs became rituals. Tesla listened and recorded, convinced that somewhere in space a higher intelligence was responding. Some believed the pulses he detected were from natural electrical phenomena, or even unknown ones like Jupiter's radio waves, but for him, that confirmed his beliefs. He believed he had been chosen, that his mind had touched the edge of the impossible. Years later, when the press no longer followed him and science advanced along paths he had anticipated but could not fund, Tesla remembered those nights with a mix of nostalgia and mystery. In his writings, he insisted that the messages were not an illusion, one way or another. Belief that Earth was surrounded by an invisible sea of energy and communication. That wasn't the only remarkable thing. Thanks to what was experienced in that laboratory, a connection would eventually be made between Tesla and the infamous incident. Tunguska. Tesla and Tunguska. At dawn on June 30, 1908 in the remote Siberian taiga, the sky suddenly lit up with such an intense glow that reindeer herders, hundreds of kilometers away, thought the sun had decided to rise. Twice, a roar shook the earth. In a matter of seconds, a fireball crossed the horizon and exploded over the Podkamanaya River in Tunguska. The blast was so intense it felled over 80 million trees in a 2,000 square kilometer area. The seismic waves traveled around the world, recorded by seismographs in different capitals. For days, the night sky over Europe and Asia was tinged with a silvery glow, as if the stars had overflowed. No crater was found, no metallic fragments, no definitive explanation. It felt like an unseen god had unleashed his wrath on Earth. Thousands of kilometers away, on the other side of the world, a man had his strangest nights. In his Colorado Springs lab, Nikola Tesla conducted experiments with what he considered his greatest creation, the Wardenclyffe Tower. Tesla had managed to generate electrical discharges so powerful that the artificial lightning coming from his tower was visible from miles away. The neighbors spoke of lights piercing through the clouds, metallic noises, and a buzzing in their bones. Tesla said he had found a way to transmit electrical energy wirelessly to any point on the planet. And then, according to a theory that still divides scientists and enthusiasts, Tesla went too far. During those years, he was obsessed with proving that his system could light up entire cities, or if desired, unleash energy as destructive as a bomb. That same year, in 1908, explorer Robert Peary was preparing to reach the North Pole. Tesla, always seeking support for his inventions, had offered to send him a wireless message or a light signal directed toward the Arctic to demonstrate his global transmission system. The theory claims Tesla activated his transmitter by sending a huge energy beam northward. But something didn't go well. The intended destination wouldn't have been the North Pole, but rather an uninhabited region of Siberia, Tunguska, and that's what happened there. An aerial explosion that released between 10 and 15 megatons of energy. It could have been the result of that failed experiment. A directed energy discharge, concentrated in the atmosphere, that was released with unimaginable power. Does this make any sense? Were the two things related? What is the official conclusion about what happened in Tunguska? I invite you to check out the video we made about it on this channel. The truth is, at this point, Tesla's dream began to fall apart. When his investor learned the project aimed to provide free energy for all, he withdrew his funding. The banks refused to invest in a system that couldn't be monopolized without funding. The construction of the tower stopped, and it remained unfinished, slowly rusting under the sun. Tesla was devastated. He lost almost all his money, and little by little his prestige began to fade away. Idolized, he was soon seen as eccentric. The new investors walked away and his laboratory was demolished. And not only that, a new and devastating blow was still to come. The patent for the radio. Across the world, a young man named Guglielmo Marconi was experimenting with wireless telegraphy. He was talented but lacked Tesla's theoretical depth. Instead, he had connections. His family was wealthy, and his last name opened doors in European business circles. With a mix of ingenuity and pragmatism, Marconi began to combine different inventions and patents from others, including those of Tesla, and present them as part of his own transmission system. In 1896, while Tesla was still working in New York, Marconi obtained a patent in Great Britain for his version of the wireless telegraph. In the United States, however, things were different. The patent office rejected his first applications, claiming that the ideas had already been registered by Tesla years earlier. It was a tacit acknowledgement of who the real pioneer had been. But Marconi persisted and improved his equipment. And with the financial support of giants and Andrew Carnegie, he achieved what Tesla didn't have: funding, connections, and a marketing machine ready to build his reputation. In 1901, Marconi achieved something spectacular. He sent a radio signal across the Atlantic. The world press hailed him as a hero and called him the man who united continents, Tesla. When he read it, he realized that the world had taken his dream and given it to someone else. To him, that feat was simply the practical use of his own work, showing what he had already conceived and explained years before. In 1904, inexplicably, the United States Patent Office revoked the patents previously granted to Tesla and awarded them to Marconi. There was no convincing public explanation. No one knew exactly what kind of pressure had been exerted on the institution, but it was clear that there were industrial interests behind Marconi. More than scientific truth. Tesla, who lacked the legal resources to take on a financial empire, couldn't do anything. In his writings, he calmly expressed his disappointment. Meanwhile, the world kept celebrating Marconi, who, with Carl Brown, won the 1909 Nobel Prize in Physics. Tesla, who had paved that way with his mind and his experiments, was completely ignored. In 1943, decades later, the Supreme Court of the United States reviewed the radio network patents. In a quiet but historic ruling, it determined that the original patents actually belonged to Nikola Tesla. It was a belated, posthumous, and purely symbolic recognition. By then, Nikola Tesla was no longer there to hear it. However, that ruling cast a shadow over the official account of history. Why was Nikola Tesla denied credit for so long? Why did the office that initially ruled for him change its decision? Just when Marconi began to receive financial backing from the most powerful men in the United States. And more importantly, what if Tesla had received the same recognition and the same awards that were given to Marconi? What things would have come out of his mind? With some support and comfort to keep experimenting? The answer? It's not hard to imagine if he had been legitimized, Tesla would have grown to become unstoppable. Even so, he kept working, convinced that his discoveries would be understood someday. His genius became a curse as he aged. He couldn't adapt to the business world or accept compromises with economic power, while others got rich from his ideas. Tesla walked alone through the streets of New York, drawing mental equations in the air. Tirelessly, his light still shone, but it was beginning to consume him. The man who had illuminated the planet was starting to sink into the shadows of his own mind. Isolation. Nikola Tesla was not an ordinary man, and his brilliance was closely tied to a kind of sensitivity that set him apart from the rest of the world. Behind the scientist who had conquered electricity was a man who lived under the weight of rituals, obsessions, and recurring thoughts that bordered on the pathological. Tesla had severe compulsive disorders. He felt repulsed touching someone's hair or shaking hands. He hated jewelry, especially pearls, which horrified him so much he couldn't even talk to women who wore them. Everything had to be orderly, clean, and balanced. He counted his steps as he walked, calculated the volume of food before eating it, and performed his activities in sequences that always had to be repeated 3 times. 3 was actually one of his main obsessions. Tesla saw in it a cosmic key, a kind of universal code that governed the proportions of the world. He used to say, if you knew the magnificence of 3, 6, and 9, you would have the key to the universe. What's more, he lived in hotel rooms whose numbers were divisible by 3. He washed his hands 3 times in a row, and before entering a building, he would walk around it 3 times. Some colleagues considered him simply obsessive, while others thought he was losing his mind. But for Tesla, those rituals weren't madness. They were a way to find balance in a chaotic world. His isolation grew over time. He rarely accepted guests, and when he did, the conversation would turn into a monologue where he talked about cosmic energy, death rays, or interplanetary communication. His view of the world grew mystical, even prophetic. He dismissed the theory of relativity as a mistake and spoke of a universal energy that connected all bodies in the cosmos. For many, these statements were evidence of his delusion. For Tesla, it was simply the next step in his quest. It became his only companion. He never married, saying his vow of celibacy kept his mind pure for discoveries. His emotions were limited to a unique love for the pigeons in Bryant Park, New York. He fed them every day and cared for them with devotion, especially a white pigeon that visited him daily. Tesla said he loved her as a man loves a woman, and that one day, when the pigeon landed on his window, he understood that. He found himself in a world that suddenly he saw as an unhappy one. He created where he was, it was. That's what it was. Jobs, a Protestant, prayed slowly, withdrawing from the world as if his own light was fading, returning to the place where the electrical storm that saw his birth began. Last years. As the new century began, the world Nikola Tesla illuminated started moving on without him. The electric companies were consolidating, fortunes were multiplying, and the patents that bore his name now belonged to others. While Thomas Edison was celebrated as the father of light, Tesla became an increasingly distant figure. A brilliant but impractical inventor, someone who talked about things that were too big for a time that only wanted immediate results. Starting in the 1910s, his life began a quiet descent into oblivion. The great projects had collapsed along with his financial stability. The companies that once supported him abandoned him, and the newspapers made him look like a cartoon character. Tesla then took refuge in New York hotels. At first he lived at the Waldorf Astoria, but over time he moved to smaller places, eventually ending up at the New Yorker Hotel, where he would occupy the room 3,327 33rd floor. He survived on small pensions from Antioquia. In 1931, when he turned 75, he was interviewed by the press. He talked about pigeons, vibrations, and the possibility of creating a machine of peace. A ray that would destroy entire armies and make war impossible. The newspapers called it the death ray of. And although he insisted that his purpose was peaceful, the myth had already been sown. The following years were a mix of poverty and late glory. Several scientific institutions began to pay him tribute, but he accepted them with distant courtesy, as if the recognition no longer belonged to him. Deep down, he knew his time was over. On January 7, 1943, the staff of the New Yorker hotel knocked on the door of his room. He didn't answer. When they finally entered, they found Nikola Tesla dead, lying on his bed, with his clothes perfectly arranged and his hands crossed over his chest. He was 86 years old. He had died alone without any witnesses in the same city as decades before. He was celebrated as the man who tamed electricity, but his story did not end with his death. Just a few hours later, FBI agents burst into his room. Tesla. Although he had lived in the United States for most of his life, he was still a citizen of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, an enemy during wartime. And the United States government feared that his research could have military value. They confiscated all his belongings, notebooks, plans, and devices. Those documents became a major 20th century mystery, though the government insisted they held nothing relevant. But later reports revealed that the papers were sent to a Massachusetts Institute of Technology engineer named John G. Trump, the uncle of future President Donald Trump. For his analysis, John Trump concluded that the writings posed no danger, although many researchers suspect that part of the material disappeared or was classified. As time went by, the legend began to grow. Tesla's followers claimed that he had discovered free energy, an unlimited source that large corporations had suppressed to maintain economic control over the world. In the 1970s, while the counterculture was rediscovering forgotten geniuses, Tesla's name resurfaced as a symbol of the rebellious inventor, the visionary who wanted to free the world from technological dependence. Documentary books and conspiracy theories turned him into an almost messianic figure, the man who knew too much, the scientist who touched the boundary between science and the divine. His body was buried in Fernclimb Cemetery in New York, and in March of that same year, his remains were cremated and placed there in an urn. After the founding of the museum that bears his name in Belgrade, all the materials that belonged to the genius began to be collected to be displayed there. In 1957, it was Tesla's ashes' turn. Upon arrival at the site, the Serbian sculptor Nebojša Mitrić designed a spherical urn that stands on a stone pedestal. Nikola Tesla's remains rest today among his inventions in his homeland. A phrase often attributed to him is still quoted today. While it's unclear if it was truly his, it could have been. It goes, "The day we truly understand energy, we will realize that everything is alive. The earth, the air, the cosmos, everything vibrates, everything is light." And perhaps in that idea lies the true end of Ryo, not in his death, but in his eternal transformation. Someone had gone so far as to kill an elephant to show the damage that electricity could cause. Tesla had lived promoting the opposite. For him, electricity was synonymous with life. The end. Tesla not only invented devices, he invented possible futures. He was the bridge between science and imagination, between the laboratory and prophetic vision. In his mind, the line between dream and reality was as thin as a thread of light. Like many visionaries, his destiny was to pay with his life for being misunderstood by his time. But that loneliness was not a failure, but the price of looking too far ahead. Today, more than an inventor, Tesla is a symbol. He represents the figure of the genius who challenges the power of man, who values truth and stays true to his vision even if rejected by the world. In an era where technology dominates every aspect of our lives, his message resonates stronger than ever. Does energy, innovation, and knowledge mean anything if they are not used to elevate humanity? What is the point of progress if progress goes hand in hand with subjugation? When the city lights turn on at nightfall, when the power grids vibrate with alternating current, that he perfected something of Tesla's spirit? It's still there, traveling through the cables, through the invisible waves in the air, reminding us that the future was once imagined by a man who was born in the middle of a storm. And maybe that's his true immortality, not the one of monuments or books, but the one of the lightning, which never stops searching for the earth. The energy that travels through time and, like its creator, refuses to fade away. Today, more than a century later, Tesla has become an almost mythical figure, a mix of a modern Prometheus and a secular saint of progress. His story is the paradox of genius, the mind that lights up the world but burns the one who possesses it. It is also the mirror of a humanity that often prefers usefulness over mystery and profit over knowledge. Tesla wanted to give free energy to everyone, but the system around him only understood money and control. The lightning that illuminated his birth was also the symbol of his brilliant, unpredictable, and fleeting destiny. Because as more and more people who study his life repeat, Nikola Tesla was not an ordinary man, he was a storm that walked among men.